a school student in Lucknow reading about the United Nations in a textbook chapter, Yoshita Singh has traveled far to New York, some 12,000 kilometers to be precise, to become the chief UN correspondent for the Press Trust of India, the country's largest wire. On August 1st, Yoshita completed 13 years at the United Nations headquarters on a perch that gives her a unique view of the goings on in 193 countries represented there. As an award winning journalist, Yoshita is now yet again getting ready for the annual UN General Assembly or the UNGA meetings starting in September, when world leaders will congregate to talk about a vast diversity of complex issues, from brutal wars to devastating climate change, and from women and children's rights to sustainable ecological goals. It is a tough assignment during the UNGA, especially for a news agency journalist who has to constantly write news reports as well as present to the camera, updating leads and making sense of innumerable speeches that go on throughout the day and sometimes even night. For someone who began tentatively in 2011, Yoshita is now a veteran of the United Nations, producing news material often on autopilot. She spoke to Mayank Shah Reports from New York. Yoshita Singh. Welcome to Mayank Shah Reports, Yoshita. It's a great pleasure to have you.
Pleasure, Mayank. Such a pleasure to be on your show. We've been friends for a long time, and to be on your show today, it's really a pleasure. I'm so delighted and so happy to share the same frame as with you. Thank you so much.
No, it's all eminently deserved. I have seen your career for a while, and like we were talking earlier, it takes a great deal to stay in such a high-powered job for so long. My congratulations. You just completed 13 years as the chief UN correspondent for the Press Trust of India. It's remarkable. Many congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mayank. Yes, I moved from Boston to New York. I remember it was July 31st, 2011. I was on a bus coming to New York when I had to take up this assignment as the UN and New York correspondent for PTI. And August 1st, 2011 was my first day in New York, working, going to the UN. I remember it was so intimidating. It was so overwhelming because coming from, I was previously based in Chicago as well, Boston, of course, before that, Delhi, Lucknow. But New York is, the whole energy was different. And incidentally, Mayank, August 1st, 2011 was the day India started its presidency of the UN Security Council during its tenure at that time, 2011 and 12.
Interesting.
Yes, so I landed in New York, and the first thing I have to cover is India's UNSC presidency on August 1, 2011.
So straight away into the deep end.
Yes, absolutely. But again, it's been a learning curve. It's been an amazing journey, learning every day. I mean, 13 years in one place seems a long time, but you know how journalism is. It teaches you something every day. No day is the same as the previous one. And so I also remember when India was in the Security Council most recently in 2021, 2022. And again, India was on served as president of the council during those terms. So it was a full circle.
Indeed. I'm curious to know, growing up in Lucknow as a young girl in a school, did you have any conception of the United Nations? And if you did, what did you think of the United Nations?
No, I think, for all of us who've grown up, in that time, UN was a chapter in a book. The way UN worked, the way UN functioned, the UN agencies. I remember we used to learn what UNICEF stands for and what the UN stands for, all these abbreviations we used to learn. So it was just another chapter in our history books, in our civics books. Of course, we knew that it was such an important organization, but it's different when you're learning it for school. You just sort of learn something for a test, and then you move on to the next grade and the next class. But to see it so upfront and close, of course, it was very, very different. So
it's remarkable from a chapter in a book, as you said,
to now have a permanent purge at the United Nations. You have an office there. I know that. I mean, it's quite. You have quite a vantage point on such a powerful organization.
Yes.
Tell me, you were mentioning about your very first day when you came and India was taking over the presidency of the UNSC. Uh, if you remember when you entered the UN building, the iconic UN building, what was your sentiment? What were you thinking?
So, of course, it's the UN building, the UN headquarters in New York. You've been there as well. It's so intimidating. It's a jigsaw puzzle. You can easily get lost. I mean, I think it takes time for you to know which way to go, because it's just a gigantic place. Within that space, it's international territory. So within that headquarters, it's a huge, gigantic place. But I think it was so overwhelming to see the UN Security Council chamber, to be in that chamber, which we've seen previously, like I said, in photos and pictures and on video or on TV news. But to actually be there and then to see India sitting as a member, the UN General Assembly hall, it's intimidating, it's overwhelming, and then you realize that this really is truly the parliament of the world, where every nation sits together. Every nation has its challenges, its issues that they want to be addressed, that they want other nations to come together and address global issues, really. So it was really intimidating, and Ambassador Hardeep Singh Puri was India's permanent representative to the UN at that time. I interviewed him as to what India's priorities will be on the first during the month of August. So, and August generally is a holiday month. They consider it as a sort of a relaxed or a holiday month before September sets in, before the UN General Assembly session starts in September. But it was a significant moment for India to be sitting in the council at that time, and of course to take forward the issues both bilaterally, multilaterally on the international forum.
Right. To digress a bit with some levity, it's interesting you mentioned about the UN building. Navigating the UN building, the interiors, I think you should get a PhD for that alone. I've been there several times and it's impossible to tell where you are, right?
Absolutely. And
describe that experience. To find places itself, it's quite a task.
It is. And so I am a resident correspondent in the UN, which means I have an office space. PTI, Press Trust
Right.
of India, has an office space in the United Nations headquarters. PTI has had we've had a presence in the UN for decades, for 60, 70 years. So we've always had a correspondent, a UN correspondent. So we've had a space in the UN headquarters, which is extremely it's a very good spot to have, because especially during the UN General Assembly, I mean, you have to navigate all these places. But coming to your question, of course, so at that point of time, there was construction and renovation happening at the UN. So we were sitting in it was the Woodrow Wilson Library building in which we were sitting. We were temporarily placed there. But to navigate from that point to, for instance, the Security Council's takeout, or the press room, which used to be in a different space also. And you can easily get lost, because you're like, okay, how do I get there? Because of security as well. Although we had a resident correspondent pass, there was a lot of security, given that it's the UN headquarters. So you had to navigate it correctly. You can't just bypass open any door and walk through it. So it took a while. It's
Right.
still sometimes, when they change security or because of the UN General Assembly sessions, you still have to navigate how to get from point A to point B.
Right. To come to the substance of what we are talking about, we are just about a month away from the next United Nations General Assembly, which happens in September generally. This will be your 13th.
Yes.
14th or 13th?
I mean, if I count 2011,
Yeah.
so, yeah.
This will be the 14th in a sense, yeah. Okay.
In a sense. But I just want to make a quick point there. There was only one General Assembly in all these years that I haven't covered. That was in 2017, because my daughter was born in September, so I went on maternity leave. So that was the only General Assembly session I hadn't covered since 2011.
So describe to me, for the benefits of younger journalists who might be watching this at some point, what it takes to prepare for something as vast as the UNGA as a journalist, because the world is there. There are so many, perhaps a million issues at play at that time. As someone who watches it so closely, what kind of preparations do you have to do yourself?
Right. So of course, every General Assembly, the year changes. The issues are different, the topics are different. So of course and obviously in the course of doing reporting on news throughout the event, which events or which news or which issues are important to your own country. For instance, if I'm reporting for India, I would see what country, what issues are of significance to India. And obviously it's in the larger context as well. So for instance, with the Russia-Ukraine war, the Israel-Hamas conflict, we know that when the world leaders come against such a background, their speeches or their statements from the General Assembly podium will touch upon some of these issues, will also touch upon some of the issues that they feel as a nation they should bring to the global table for discussions, for coordination. I remember from the Sustainable Development Goals, the climate change. So there are certain issues that, of course, go every year, but for this year, for instance, the UN General Assembly session will happen in September, and there will be a Summit of the Future. It's an ambitious, high-level event, Summit of the Future, with the UN Secretary General is convening. It's about talking about the road ahead after 2030, when the Sustainable Development Goals targets are met or not met. Then what's the road ahead? And we've seen in the wake of the pandemic, in the wake of these conflicts, these wars that are raging, in the wake of income inequality. So really what the roadmap going forward should be. So there are a lot of issues that happen during the year, and a news cycle, it changes by the seconds.
Right.
So specifically, I think what as a journalist or as a journalists from India or from any other country, I think we also have to look at what are the issues that our country are bringing to the table. Solutions, challenges, everything, because I think the UN is one platform where everybody can mix together their challenges, mix together their problems, and also come up with a solution that hopefully works for everyone.
That brings me to the very important aspect of what you do, or what any journalist on an assignment like would do. You described a whole gamut of issues. I was thinking about the amount of reading that goes into keeping abreast of what is up now, because it changes, like you said, it changes so dramatically all the time. Tell me, in terms of reading before the General Assembly, do you have a certain routine, or now after 13 years, it's sort of you're an autopilot in some ways?
Maybe a little bit on autopilot, because some of the issues in the UN, they have been going on and on
Yes.
and on for so many years. I mean, you would have seen the UN Security Council reform, for instance. We
Right.
talked about it so much when India was in the council in 2011. I mean, I've been in the UN for 13 years, and I've written about the same thing, and we all know how much the needle has moved on that end. So UN Security Council reforms, we all talk about how it is important to reform the council, how there should be more permanent members, India should sit as a permanent member. And now when we see the global challenges, and we see how the Security Council has failed time and again to address its core mandate of maintaining international peace and security, I mean, we can go on and on about how important it is to reform this old structure. The UN, Mayank, will celebrate its 80th birthday next year. It's going to be 80 years old, but it's still stuck in the time frame when it was formed. So
Absolutely.
you can see that the world has changed. But again, coming to your question, of course, some of the issues, since I reported on it for so long, I have a sense of how they will go, or for instance, background information. But of course, you have to read up. You have to read up news. You have to read up reports that come out of the UN. You have to read up other journalists' assessments, both in the Western media as well as the Indian media, because that's how you sort of know what's happening, and you brighten your horizon.
Right.
Because just focusing on what you know doesn't help, right? So you
Absolutely.
need to. Yes.
I'm glad you mentioned the United Nations reform in that particular context, the United Nations Security Council. It strikes me that the permanent members, the US, Britain, France, China, Russia, two of them are essentially totalitarian systems. Two of them are former colonizers who have basically preyed upon the rest of the world for decades. I'm talking about Britain and France. and you have the fifth one, the US, which is the de facto imperial power at this stage, even now, despite the growth of China. And yet, the world's largest democracy has been kept out for decades. And this has been India's angst for a very long time. Every year it's mentioned, every year we make a lot of noise about it. Nothing really happens. And when we are granted this passing presidency, people feel a bit exultant for some silly reason. Tell me, what's your perspective on why it is that the UN thinks it's all right to keep the world's largest democracy out of the UNSC?
I mean, you're right that India, being the world's largest democracy, the world's most populous country now, it overtook China. And also, we've seen during India's, for instance, G20 presidency, it really is it's emerged as the voice of the global South. It's of the developing countries, and a lot of the issues that India deals with. People, other countries can take examples and help, that they can help address issues in their own nations. But we all know where the opposition is coming from. Nobody wants to give up power, the power of the veto, because they know that when you expand or reform a body like the UN Security Council, and if you have more members coming in, the new members, that's what India has been saying, that the permanent members have to be increased. The veto has been a question of, because the P5 right now, they don't want to give up their veto power, because through that they have been controlling really the entire system. And there is a growing voice, especially among the least developed countries, among the developing countries, that their issues are not being addressed properly because of this lobby of P5, if I may say that they control what mandates go into peacekeeping. They control everything. And for instance, in UN peacekeeping, when countries like India and others are contributing so many troops, hundreds of thousands of troops through the years, but they don't have a say in the mandate. So clearly there's a lot of voice and there's a lot of traction now that this cannot go on forever. And I think, from the P5 point of view, they wouldn't want to change what's been perpetuated for so long, because then that just takes away their power. But clearly, I think, there's really snail's pace of movement happening there. We'll see where it goes. But otherwise, then I think we see that then in India's presidency of the G20 or other blocs, for instance, we have Quad, BRICS, IPSA.
Right.
Then the countries will come up with their sort of groups and blocs to ensure that their national interests, their regional interests are taken forward and addressed, and they don't have to depend on the UN Security Council to address their issues.
Antonio Guterres, the current UN Secretary General, has been one of the most candid figures that I've seen in that body for a long time. But when it comes to issues like climate change, especially climate change, he is so direct, he's so in your face in many ways, and rightly so. How is it that he has not been able to focus on the reform, especially in the context of the UNSC? Or do you think he has tried?
I mean, he has been very vocal, Mayank. He has said that institutions like the Security Council, the Bretton Woods institutions, they have to be reformed. The financial structure, international financial structure, has to be reformed, because he also mentioned that the debt traps, the debt issues that some of these least developing and developing countries in the world face is because of an archaic international financial system. So, and also on Security Council reform, he has said that the Security Council has to be reformed. But I think it all comes down to the UN membership. We also ask at the press briefing, for instance, from his spokesperson, if somebody makes a comment on Security Council reform, they all say it's all on the UN membership. It's all on the UN membership. I mean, the UN is comprised of 193 members. Of course, everybody is going to have differences. Of course, everybody is going to have their own opinions as to how they want the council to be reformed. We have this United for Consensus group in which Pakistan is there, and the G4 group in which India is there. So there are these blocks, and everybody has a different formula of how the Security Council should be reformed. Some say the permanent members should be given a veto power just as the P5 are. Some are saying that no, the permanent members can be added, but there shouldn't be a veto power. So there's just, 193 members have 193 opinions.
Right.
And to really narrow it down to something that's workable, it's in international diplomacy, we all know. And I think it's also that the countries have their foreign policies set, so they don't want to differ from that too much.
Right.
I mean, it's all right for 4 members out of the P5 to say that they support India's council membership, permanent membership, but when it actually comes down to putting things on paper or to set them in stone, we'll see how those things move, because like I said, 193 countries have their own opinions, their own calculations as to how a council should be reformed. So it
Right.
takes time for all of them to agree on something.
Yeah. Speaking of issues that do not go away, Kashmir. It's been there since 1947, although left to India, India wouldn't like it to be there at all. But the fact is that year after year, decade after decade, it gets raked up routinely. Nothing happens really of consequence at the end of the day. Pakistan gets into its familiar fulminations, India responds, and that's that. How do you deal as a journalist with an issue which is so jaded? How it's a challenge to come up with fresh stories or fresh perspective. I'm very curious to know.
Yeah, so Kashmir again, it's been on the in the UN sort of agenda, but Mayank, India has categorically stated that it is a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan to be solved. Of course, Pakistan does not agree with this assessment, and that's why it keeps raking up Kashmir at every given point in the UN. I'll come back to that, but to India's point, that India has maintained it's a bilateral issue that has to be solved between India and Pakistan, and of course, against the context, against the background of the terrorism that emanates from Pakistan, India is very firm that Pakistan has to first deal and root out all the terrorism on its soil before India and Pakistan can talk. So, like Pakistan rakes up Kashmir all the time. It has a friend in the permanent in a permanent member, China, that whose support and backing it has. I want to give you an example, man. There's so many forum so many platforms in the UN, and so many agendas, so many debates. But Pakistan mentions Kashmir in every forum, every debate. They somehow link any agenda, anything with Kashmir, try to rake it up, try to internationalize it, but there has really been no traction of the issue. Countries have said that it is a bilateral issue between India and in Pakistan. I mean, we've seen recently that Turkey also somehow then brings up the issue of Kashmir during its General Assembly debates in September. But beyond that, there is no traction. Pakistan will sit in the UN Security Council next year as a non-permanent member. So we can be sure that it will try and bring in Kashmir as a topic of discussion, or bring the matter in the council with the backing of China. But for the rest of the membership, it clearly remains a bilateral issue, and Pakistan doesn't get any traction when it tries to raise up the issue, and India gives it back. India gives stern rights of reply, which we've seen. We've seen the Pakistani leaders come and speak about it in the General Assembly debate, for instance, the high-level debate that happens. The Pakistani leaders come for 40 minutes, 35 minutes is on India and Kashmir and Indian issues. So, but then India's right of reply, they're all back. We've seen the strong response that comes from India, but so I think that's what happens on the global stage.
Yeah. The UN is headquartered in a country which is at best apathetic towards the entire idea of the United Nations. Traditionally, the US has treated the United Nations quite cavalierly. There are so many on the Republican side and elsewhere who almost dismiss it as something of no consequence. Given that, and given the fact that UN still remains a very decisive institution worldwide, how do you think the UN has balanced between these two perspectives?
Right. I think the UN is there for the entire world. The UN is there for kids, small kids who are not getting education. I mean, for instance, through UNICEF. The UN is there for UN women, really trying hard to work in countries like Afghanistan, where women's rights are, as we see, are taken back. So, of course, every country has its criticism of the UN. Every country has its view of how the UN is not able to, meet today's demands, today's global issues. But the UN also has a lot of presence across the country, across the world, where it's really helping people on the ground. Humanitarian issues, for instance, peacekeeping issues. The aid that UN is able to give to young children, young women, girls, people in conflict zones. So I think that is something that is still there. And irrespective of the criticism that's directed towards it, some of the work that the UN does is extremely important. And without it, it's easy to make orders here or pass judgments from an American point of view, for instance, that we will cut funding. But when you cut funding to a UN agency, the impact is really felt on the ground. For instance, in a war zone, in a conflict zone, anywhere in the world, which means that young kids will not get their food, women will not get their essential medical needs, men will be tied up in this circle of conflict. So I think the overall impact that UN still has, the blue of the UN that people see, and then they know that, okay, yes, if that's around, they will get some help, because otherwise we know that the world is really going up in flames. So I think you need an agency like the UN that, with its humanitarian assistance.
How do you see the evolution of India, especially since 2014? And I ask, especially because the projection from Delhi has been that there has been a rise of a very muscular external affairs ministry, which takes no nonsense from anyone at the UN. You started covering 3 years prior to that, so you have some experience of the way India positioned itself. In my observation, in my view, India has always been a pretty straight shooter when it comes to any issue, especially those that concern the country. How do you see the last 10 years India's performance?
Right. No, I mean, definitely, India's foreign policy in the last 10 years, 2014 to now, for the foreign policy as such it's been the same. I mean, it hasn't changed, but it's an assertive foreign policy. I would agree. It's assertive in the sense that India is unapologetically standing its ground. It's assertive in the sense in the decisions it has taken, and also, for instance, during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was a lot of talk from the Western side that it has to be condemned, and India has to stand, for instance, with the US against Russia and in this conflict. But we've all seen how India has stood its ground in this situation, and Prime Minister Modi has said to, for instance, the Russian president, that this is not an era of war. He has spoken to the Ukrainian side as well. So that way, the balance is there. But I think it all comes down to India's issue, its own domestic issues, its own national interests. And especially when we've seen there were resolutions in the Security Council, in the UN General Assembly, in which India abstained. And again, initially there was a lot of criticism that India is not siding with the US, India is siding with, in the sense, Russia, if it's not abstaining. But I think from India's point of view, it was India's decision, it was India's national decision, and its long-standing relations with Russia. We know that India's relations with Russia go back way more than India's relations with the US. So it has to balance its geopolitical interests. It has to balance its historical interest with all these countries, and take a stand that also does not impact its domestic people, its citizens. For instance, during the war, Russia-Ukraine war, there were concerns about the prices of fuel and food and everything rising, and there was again criticism of India buying Russian oil. But again, we've seen External Affairs Minister Jaishankar saying that the amount of oil that probably India buys from Russia, it's Europe buys more in a month. He
right.
Yes. So I think again to sort of phrase it that yes, India it's an assertive player now on the global stage. When it sits in the Security Council, it not just voices its own issues, it voices the issues of the other developing countries together with it. And being the largest democracy in the world, of course, you have to ensure that your voice is heard. You're not and voice is heard loud and clear.
The next UNGA is taking place in the looming shadows of the Russia-Ukraine war as well as Israel-Hamas war. Especially in the context of Israel-Hamas war, there has been a long-standing view that the United Nations is reflexively against Israel. It's not necessarily true, but that's the angst that Israelis have. How do you see these two wars playing out during the UNGA? Because it's been a while. They've gone on for a long time, including the Israel-Hamas war, which was supposed to be over in a few days' time. It's several months now, more than 6 months now. So how do you see these two playing out in this next UNGA?
So of course, when the world leaders descend on the UN headquarters in September, this will be front and center in their discussions, in their debates. They will mention that the wars have to end. There will be, of course, mention of this in their speeches. The US will lay out its own policy in this regard. It will be President Biden's, for instance, last address to the General Assembly in his term, right? So, people will say a lot of things. People will make speeches. There will be a lot of projection as to how the war should end. It's civilians are getting impacted. All that will be there, but I think the important point is that it's good to make all these speeches, but it's really important to have actual action on the ground. The wars have to stop, and in this day and age of so much income inequality, so we have seen the conflicts that the impact that the conflicts are having on people on generations to go now. I mean, it's not just a 7-month or an 8-month-old conflict. The impact it will have going forward for generations. So, of course, there will be a lot of talk about it, but eventually, and then people will come, they'll make their speeches, they'll go back. Does anything change? That will only change when there's actual action on the ground. So we can all say the wars have to end, but we have to see what the actual action is.
Just last couple of things. One is I'm interested to know about your day at the UN, especially during the UNGA, because it is very hectic. I know that for a fact, because you're torn in so many different directions. There are stakeouts and there are sudden impromptu press briefings, and suddenly you have some random minister from India showing up and some NGO showing up, and you are really chasing all of that. So tell me a bit about how you balance your day during the UNGA.
So the days are a blur during the UNGA. The days start very early. Usually it's the External Affairs Minister, Prime Minister of India, the External Affairs Minister, who come for the UN General Assembly high-level sessions. Last year it was External Affairs Minister Jaishankar. This year we are hoping that Prime Minister Modi will come and address the general debate. He's listed on September 26th. But coming to your question, of course, there are a lot of issues and a lot of events that are happening around the UN General Assembly time. Of course, I focus on the Indian events where the Indian ministers are meeting. There are so many multilateral, bilateral side meetings that happen on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. So we always have a BRICS foreign ministers meeting, IPSA, G4, all these other multilateral forums meet on the sidelines. So their days are packed, and we are really following them around the city from one point to the other. They come with high energy, and but I think again, having been in this line, covering this for 13 years, you get a sense of how to make sure that you're covering all the angles. And PTI being a news agency, you really can't miss any angle. I make like 5-6 stories out of one speech or one event, because you really have to cover every angle in that.
Right.
So it's hectic days, start at 6, and of course navigating the New York grid at that point of the time because it is because of the security. Manhattan and the New York area near the United Nations headquarters, it's really fortified. There's a lot of security. So sometimes when you walk a walk that takes you from point A to point B will be 5 minutes, but you're in the General Assembly, you have to navigate 15 minutes, 20 minutes. So you're actually running from one point to the other, giving news as it is happening, typing on your phone, typing while you're walking, surviving on probably fruits and snacks or whatever you can, get hold of. It does get busy, but I think it's an exhilarating feeling as well to be reporting firsthand, to be witnessing. History is made every year. I mean, there's something or the other that the UN brings to the table. So you're reporting what is happening in the UN, what the leaders are saying, what implications that will have for their countries, for the global order. So, of course, and there's always this chance of you running into some world leader or somebody in the halls of the UN, because then everybody's walking around from one place to the other, get to the meeting. So it's long days and long nights, and I think those 7-10 days are a blur.
The ideal job would be that of the famous character Tintin, who is a journalist, but he doesn't file any stories at all. He just travels, has fun, and that's that. I often think about that. Yeah,
Tintin is a favorite with a lot of journalists, so I get that.
Yes. But the way you described it, a lot of people. On top of that, you also have PTI video now, right? That you do video reporting as well.
Yes.
It's a hell of a lot of work.
It is. So I am. So the video service started last year, and Prime Minister Modi was in the UN last year for the Yoga Day. Again, I had reported on his first address to the UN in 2014 when he became the Prime Minister and when he proposed this day, International Day of Yoga. And then 2015, June 21st, the first International Day of Yoga was commemorated in the UN. Mrs. Sushma Swaraj was the External Affairs Minister then. So I covered that. And then again, last year, Prime Minister Modi himself was in the UN to lead this historic Yoga Day celebration. So yes, it was, and we had to make video reports of it. Then we had to also file a story and sometimes take a photo and send that. So it does get a lot, but with video also, a lot of things are webcast, a lot of things are available online. So that direct feed is taken from there, but then again, that's journalism. You have to juggle all these.
True, but it's people who do not practice journalism do not realize how physical it is.
Yes.
The sheer act of writing.
Yes.
Forget the intellectual part of marshalling facts and marshalling perspectives. The sheer act of typing itself is a lot, especially for an agency journalist where you're constantly expected to come up with leads all the time.
Of course. And Prime Minister Modi, he addresses in Hindi, so you have to translate that in English. And of course, the translation is there, but when you're filing a story immediately, I mean, you have to make sure what he said and what you're writing is correct, it's accurate. And also PTI being an agency, we have to be very, we have to ensure that our news reports are accurate and unbiased, and there's no margin of error. Because once the news goes, it goes like wildfire, it's everywhere. So, we also have to, while we're doing our stories, while we're covering all these important events, side events, multilateral events, bilateral meetings that the leaders are having, of course, you're constantly texting, writing, but you also have to make sure that you don't make a mistake, or you don't, your facts are right, your facts are correct, because otherwise, the wrong news goes everywhere. So, but again, I think having done this for so many years, I know it helps, but of course, we are humans, we tend to make mistakes. Of course, if I'm filing a print story, the video will get delayed, or if I'm doing a video story, the print will get delayed. So all that is there, but again, it's a teamwork, working with the team in Delhi. So I think it all comes together.
To conclude, you come from a lineage in the sense your father has been a distinguished journalist himself. What kind of role the fact that he was a journalist played in your becoming one?
Right. Thanks for that question, Mayank. Yes, my father, Mr. Ravindra Singh, he's based in Lucknow, and he's a veteran journalist, covered UP politics for 50 years.
Right.
And I grew up in that environment in the sense I saw him working on deadlines. For instance, the Ayodhya Babri Masjid demolition that happened, he was there. He was reporting right from the center of it, in the midst of it. So I've seen him do all these challenging reporting, and I think so. Yeah, genetics did play a part in there, but overall, also the conviction, the hard work, the sincerity, and the dedication that he brought to his job.
Right.
Yes. So I think that's what inspired me, and that's what I've taken in me. Like, and of course the support that my mother gave him. He was traveling, he was covering all these, he was traveling a lot for work, and then the support that my mother extended him in bringing me and my sister up. So the same here. I mean, being a journalist, it's not a 9 to 5 job. Anything can happen anytime. A news story can break anytime. There are no holidays, no weekends. So the family support there is very important. But I think the sincerity, the dedication, or my hard work that I bring to my profession is what I've imbibed from my father. There's a saying that there might not be a lot of money in the profession, but respect that you command with your work, and that I've seen with my father. The respect that he commands still, his authority in journalism, and just the experience that he brings to the table. That's what something I aspire to be. I mean, he's a veteran, and I've only been in the profession for 20 years. There's still a long way for me to go, but his values of hard work, sincerity, dedication, and not being, influenced by anybody, not anybody letting you influence your story, your journalism. Those ethics, I think, are very, very crucial, especially in this day and age. So that's one thing I take from him, and that'll always be with me. So that's how I hope to continue my journalism journey.
On that note, Yoshita, it's been a terrific pleasure to talk to you. I think we covered a lot of ground. You gave a very broad, very instructive perspective on what goes on at the United Nations. And once again, my congratulations on a remarkable stint, 13 years at the UN, and to many more. I'm sure it's something that you are now used to it. I doubt if you would be happy at a place which is not the world, right?
I think that's what it is. That's what I agree. The UN is just, people have said that, it's been a long. There are always two sides, two opinions, right? So it's been a long journey, 13 years, one place. But again, there's just so much that's happening in the world, and the power that we journalists have to put the story out. I know that if I'm writing a story, presenting the facts, informing the audiences in India, across the world, as to what's happening, I think that's just, there can be no comparison to that. And the UN is such a platform. When I moved to New York from Boston, my husband was still in Boston, and I used to commute back and forth. So I thought, okay, again, this is coming back to the first day of joining UN. I was like, okay, maybe this will last for a year. I don't know how I'll do it, but it's been
13 years now.
2 years, and still there's still lots that I have to learn myself. There's still a lot of improvement that I feel I can bring to the work, and that's all. That's all the sincerity that I can get to the work. That to just continue doing what I'm doing, make it better, and but again, thank you so much, Maya.